week, and we're going to try to finish up some of what we looked at last week and hopefully swing into another portion of it. Now, I want to back up and kind of get a running start into this one because I know a lot of times, and I don't like when we have a sermon or a class or something like that that's based on something previous, because a lot of times people are out of town. Scoot this out of your way. Out of town, or whatever the case. And so we're going to try to back up and kind of come back into this one a little bit. Remember, what we're looking at right now is when you study the Bible, there's stories, narratives, there's truths, there's poetry, there's history, there's prophecy, there's all that kind of study. And all that study is 100% useful. But the Bible also teaches in other ways and approves of other ways. And some of those ways, their significance is only to reinforce, to make things even stronger in our minds. Can you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and just read the New Testament? Absolutely. Can you better understand why we need Jesus and the nature of God, and just understand the New Testament in general better if you study the Old Testament, or if you are familiar with the Old Testament? Yes. Then you can go through, and with the more familiar you come with the New Testament, and you go back to the Old Testament and start putting some stuff together, things start making more and more sense. Then you look at cultural things. Well, what we've really been spending a lot of time on is looking at this type-anti-type thing, which is a way that God showed that none of this was accidental. He had this plan from the beginning. It's so easy for us to look at the Bible and we would never say out loud, it's like God didn't get it right. But it's hard not to think that sometimes, because there were adaptions and changes. Then you get in the New Testament, and Paul says something like, these times of ignorance God overlooked. Okay, well, what does that mean? And then you have Jesus saying things like, but from the beginning it was not so. Well, the idea there is God had something in mind. It didn't go real well, so he had to. So these type, anti-type things, these connections from the Old to the New Testament that are very intentional, very purposeful, help us understand that it wasn't, that God always planned to do it this way. Prophecy helps with that, but this is even another layer of that, where not only does God just say, here's what's going to happen, and then it happens, but he has planted these things that were sufficient for the moment in the Old Testament, but were chosen specifically so that when you read the New Testament, or when we came to the New Testament, we could believe even more, even stronger, have even more evidence that this is what God wanted. And the biggest one to go to that we said all on the way is the ark, the flood. Because in 1 Peter chapter 3, this is where we have no doubt that God has done this. Peter says that the reason that the flood was used is so that baptism would be understandable, and you would know that's what God wanted you to do. That's what he says in 1 Peter 3:21. There's also an anti-type, which now saves us. And then he's referring back to the verses right before it when he's talking about they were saved through the water. The water of the flood was to represent baptism in the New Testament. On one side of the water was life, on the other side was death. On one side was the world, on the other side was the family of God. On one side was those who were far from God, those who live righteously. I mean, it's just, and then you look at the ark in and of itself. It's got one door. Jesus says, I'm the door. It's got specific dimensions. Jesus said, Paul says there's a pattern for this thing. It just goes hand in hand. Well, the one that we spent some time on last week that we're going to come back and look at this week is one that, from everything we can understand, the only reason that it was even mentioned in the Old Testament was so that in the New Testament the proof of Jesus' priesthood and what that means could be used. So I want everybody to go to Genesis 14. We're going to go back over these verses real quick. There's just this quick narrative. Abram has gone out to rescue Lot. He had this little battle. He comes back in. There has been these other kings that had been in a battle. And in Genesis 14, starting at verse 18, we're introduced to a man. We've never heard of him before. We don't know anything about him. And we just know what's told. And then we move forward, and he's mentioned again in a psalm. So we'll look at that in a second. So you look at Genesis 14, starting at verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine and was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who's delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. That was Abram. Now, the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom. Now, this is switching gears back to Sodom. But the point is, he then goes in and actually applies what it was that Melchizedek done. So we've got this just brief, that's it. There was a battle. Lot had been taken. Abram goes out to get him, comes back, and when he's coming back, there's some kings that are meeting him, and Melchizedek comes out. Melchizedek was a priest, and Abram was respectful to him. That's what we know. That's the story. There you go. Now you go over to Psalm 110. The next time he's mentioned is Psalm 110. It's a prophetic psalm. And so now you have in Psalm 110, you have in verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. We don't know of the order of Melchizedek. We don't know that there was an order of Melchizedek. We know that there was a high priest named Melchizedek, and we know that that David in the Psalms is projecting forward. Hey, that's going to be used again because this is a prophetic psalm. You are of the order of Melchizedek. Well, the Hebrew writer is where the whole thing unplays. He's going to refer back to this in just a little bit. So remember, what we're looking at here is this 2-verse introduction to a man, a 1-verse reminder almost of him, and that's all we know. You read your Old Testament, you forget the guy even exists. You get to Psalm 110 and you're like, I don't even know who that is, and you just keep going because he's not there's nothing major going on. Where this shows back up, and the reason it's so important is we go over to Hebrews chapter 5. In Hebrews chapter 5, the context of the book of Hebrews is so important as to why this is even important. Now, the truth of the matter is, to the average person, most people, who Melchizedek is, why he's being mentioned in the book of Hebrews, why it just doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. And even still, it's difficult for us still to find any relevance in it because we don't care about the high priests anymore. We talk about high priests, and I mean, we don't care about the high priests. I mean, we might go back and can name a couple of them. We know some things that were going on with them, but we're so far removed from that this seems like an inconsequential study. But here's the key to it all, and the reason we even look at it. The Hebrew letter is written to a group of people who are questioning their faithfulness to God through Christ. They're questioning whether or not they should remain followers of Christ. They live in Jerusalem. The church has been established, Acts chapter 2. Many of these folks were converted on that day. Many of those are the thousands that were converted later, or the myriads, or the words that are used throughout the book of Acts. And they either lived in Jerusalem or they stayed in Jerusalem. Now, the church has been scattered. The church of Jerusalem has had, some difficulties because the Jews are tired of these Christians. The Romans still aren't real sure what to do with them. And so the emperors have changed, and there's just all kinds of things that are brewing. And these Jews are thinking, these Jews who had converted to Christianity are thinking, I thought this would happen faster. I mean, I was converted on a forgiveness of sins, Jesus is coming back to take us to heaven kind of theology. I was converted on a, you did some miracles, you convinced me that he was the Son of God. I now have been converted, but nothing's happened. As a matter of fact, it's getting worse. It's more difficult. The Hebrew writer is doing everything that he can in the book of Hebrews to remind them that they committed to God through Jesus and his church because it was the better way and, in all honesty, the only option. Because he's going to talk about there was an annulling of the former commandments. And he's going to talk about that it would grown old, grown obsolete, and would vanish away. So, and he was trying to tell them the Old Testament really doesn't even exist anymore. The New Testament exists, and you're a part of that, and you need to stay there. And so this study that on this man and bringing this up is to solidify, to almost re-remind. They've already been reminded. To re-remind them that Jesus is the Son of God, and this was God's plan from the beginning. And so in chapter 1, he starts off in the book of Hebrews saying, God spoke in different times in different ways, but he spoke to you through his Son. That's the very, that if a king sent a delegation, that's important. If a king sent his Son as a delegation to send his message, that was a really big deal to them. So he says God chose to speak to you through his Son. Well, now he's saying, but he went from being God to being a little lower than the angels. But don't think he was just like any normal man. And then he compared him to Moses, said Moses was in the house, but Jesus is over the house. He was better than the best man that you got. And then as he's moving along, he says, okay, well, in the Old Testament there was offered a day of rest. The rest that Jesus is offering you is eternal. Like, we're not talking about a day, we're talking about eternity. And he really begins to ramp it up. Well, here in chapter 5 is when the Hebrew writer begins to really change his tone. He goes from saying, come on, guys, don't forget, to being, you should know better. I shouldn't be having to tell you this. And so he says, you don't need me to go over these first principles anymore. You need milk, but you really should be eating meat. You should be teaching people this, but you're needing me to reteach this to you. And he says, if I have to, I will. But we really need to move on. And he says, to some deeper things. And he throws out something, we mentioned this last week, that would be really difficult for them to grasp. And that was this, if you've fallen away, then it's impossible to return. Well, they're saying, well, wait just a second. I thought the whole thing was repentance. Like Acts 2, repentance, And so the tenses of the words play into that because he's really trying to re-engage them with a challenging. It's kind of like, and I hate to use this example, but it's just one that works. My dad was not faithful. He knew the truth. He knew his Bible pretty well, actually. There would just be periods of time where he just wouldn't go to church. He knew. He just wouldn't go. And he might not go for 6 or 9 months. And then, somebody would come to the house, say, we've been missing you. He'd show back up for a little while. And they'd try to get him involved. And I always remember during those times when he wasn't coming, when something would come up, he would quote the Bible. And it was kind of like, that doesn't mean so much coming from you right now. I mean, I would never say that, But if you know so much, why aren't you using it? If you know so much, why are you not going to church? If you're so aware of, what the Bible says, then it really is hard for me to grasp that you're not doing it, but you know it. That's what he's telling them right here. You know this stuff, and you're thinking about walking away from it? Well, why would you do that? Because you know it. And so, in the midst of this, trying to re-engage them, one of their big hang-ups, apparently, because so much of the book of Hebrews, so a big chunk of Hebrews is about these high priests. Well, you and I read Hebrew and we're like, high priest, high priest, high priest, high priest. It just doesn't mean anything to us. I mean, it's literally historical and historical only. But it was there every day. It was there every day. They lived in Jerusalem. They knew who the high priest was. They knew who, it's like, it'd be like if my friend Alan over here moved to Auburn, Alabama, the town. It'd be like him moving over there and thinking about becoming a fan of Auburn, thinking about it. See, he'd been an Alabama fan. Now he's coming down here to Auburn, and he knows the head coach because they're always talking about that head coach down there. Everywhere he goes, they're talking about the players, and they're talking about the next recruiting class, and they're talking about all this kind of stuff. And he's considering it. And then we got somebody else you're an Alabama fan, aren't you? All right, you get in touch with a man and say, what are you thinking? Do you not remember Bear Bryant? Do you not know who Nick Saban is? Why are you thinking about going to that? What's wrong with you? That's what's going on here, except they're thinking about going back to it. And that's the scenario. They are entrenched in this Jewish culture that they were once a part of. Jesus hasn't come back. Well, Alabama hadn't won any national championships in the last couple years. This might be a good year to change. That's the way they're looking at it. This is getting harder, not easier. It was easy when this whole forgiveness thing was going around. It was easy when everybody was fired up about the miracles. It was easy, but now it's hard, and it's a little bit more difficult to hang in there. And so he's wanting to say, wait just a second. Let's talk a little bit more about these folks that you're around all the time. And so he spends a big chunk of Hebrews talking about these high priests and their sacrifices and them as individuals. And he's constantly comparing what Jesus is. So he just decides, as he's just about to say, y'all should be doing better, he throws out something real deep for them. Then he says you ought to be doing better, gives them something else deep, and then comes back to his original thought. So in chapter 5, starting at verse 5, so he's talked about he's talked about the high priest. He's introduced his discussion of the high priest. There's been a rest that's promised. Then in verse 11, this is the fourth of 8 warnings in the book of Hebrews, where he says, let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. So he's saying, let's be motivated by this rest. And then he introduces this discussion on the high priest in verse 14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest. Well, all of a sudden they're going, this is one of the reasons they're thinking about going back, obviously. And so he says, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. Now, the reason he says passed through the heavens is because you know that the Jews had 3 heavens. When they talked about it, there was the heavens where the birds lived, there were the heavens where the stars lived, and there were the heavens where God lives. That's their 3 heavens. Well, he says he passed through the heavens, which is interesting because it appears as though, this is one of those little insight things that's just fun to look at. It appears as though he's communicating that Jesus went through the sky and space. It's just, he says he passed through the heavens. All right, so anyway, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us, verse 16, therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Now, this church, the Jerusalem church, is having some difficulties. And so he's saying, not only do you not need to go back to the Jewish faith, you need to hang on to Jesus because he can help you with this. And if we go to him and ask him, he can. And then he gives us these qualifications, chapter 5, verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifice for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Says, well, he can understand it because he could have temptation. Because of this is required verse 3, because of this he is required as for the people, so also for himself to offer sacrifice for sin. It says, well, he can have compassion. We have one who can also have compassion, but this guy can have compassion, but it's because he's like you. Jesus isn't like you. This man has compassion because he has to sacrifice for his own sins. Jesus didn't have to sacrifice for his own sins. And that's what he's saying. So then he says in verse 4, and no man takes this honor to himself, but he was called by God, just as Aaron was. So he says this is not something that you just put on yourself. This is something that God gives you. Now he's going to introduce this Melchizedek talk. So verse 5, so also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, you are my son, today I've begotten you. So let me ask you something. Why do you think he says that? Why is he making the point? Jesus didn't do this for himself. Jesus didn't appoint himself the priest. Why do you think that's important? I'm going to stop and let y'all talk for a second here. I'm sorry. Why do you think he felt necessary to make that point? That's always been an interesting point to me. He goes out of his way just to throw in here that Jesus didn't appoint himself. Why do you think that is? That the Jews would have believed in that, but they're trying. I think he's trying to eliminate any unnecessary talk about a man appointing himself to a high position. You know, I mean, I could walk in and go, God told me that I'm going to be, I'm going to get rid of these elders and I'm going to be the elder. And I mean, you're going to, pick me up and throw me through the back wall, which you should. But if I was convincing enough and I was persuasive enough, I might talk some people into thinking that, right? Well, let's look at the history here. Let's look at the culture. Let's look at what God's always really want. And my point is they're trying to eliminate any argumentation on this man. This man came around and tried to fool a bunch of you people. No, he didn't do this of himself. God put him in this place. And it's just, I don't think it's a strong argument. I think it's a necessary argument, if that makes sense. Because you could refute that and go, well, I could say that God, told me whatever. It's just dropped in there, yeah.
The Jews always knew that there was God.
Yeah, that's right.
And they knew that God was the highest authority. And it was the words that God spoke said.
Yeah. Well, they had to believe that the Hebrew writer was from God as well, right? So whoever the Hebrew writer was, if they trusted him, then they were trusting this word, right? Because there were a lot of letters circulated that pretended to be from apostles. Paul mentioned some of those. And so that there had to be some authenticity here. Now, I think the key connection that he was trying to get them to make was this. You know that God was going to send the Messiah. You know that he did all these miracles and all these great things. You know what happened in this city, in Acts chapter, what we call Acts chapter 2. God did that, not Jesus. So it was appealing to a higher authority for that. But anyway, this is where he comes back and says in verse 6. He also says in another place, and this is the Psalm 110, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, They knew Psalms 110. As a matter of fact, Acts chapter 1 mentions the book of Psalms. He quotes something and says, as it says in the book of Psalms. That's Acts chapter 1. Well, the reason that's important is because that lets us know they had a book of Psalms. You know, we have it, but they had it too. So they were familiar with these Psalms, very, very, very familiar with them. And so when they would quote them, they knew them pretty well. Well, they knew Psalm 110 as a prophetic psalm. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 through 12, they knew that what was being told to them was not for them, but for us. And they were real curious about it, but we now know it. It's that kind of thing. And so he's quoting this psalm that they knew was a prophetic psalm. But you got to remember, in the flow of the discussion here and the purpose of this argument, he's just dropping this right here so he can come back in just a second and pick it up. He's letting them know that we're about to shift gears. Okay, so if we've got a conversation here between some old Alabama fans, we're going to throw out the big stuff first, right? Nick Saban, Bear Bryant, national championships. But if you really are trying to convince, you're going to say, but what about all the tickets you bought? What about all the t-shirts you have? We're going to get a little bit more personal. What about the recruiting class that's coming up? Do you know what the 2028 recruiting class is looking at? No. Only real true fans know that. You know what I'm saying? Like, I have no idea what it's looking like. But he's appealing to a deeper school of thought here. If you remember, the psalmist said that there was going to be a high priest come in the order of Melchizedek. Remember that? He goes, let me just kind of drop that there. So then he comes back in verse 7, and he just kind of introduces some of the, okay, so let's read verse 6 again. This Hebrews 5, verse 6. As he also says in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayer and supplication with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience. Now, interestingly enough here, he's talking about Jesus. Do you see what he did? You have to read that again to see what he did, because it sounds like he's talking about Melchizedek, but he's not. It sounds like it. He's really trying to dig it. He's trying to get them to grasp something. He's making them go, what'd you say? Because read it again. He says in verse 6, and he also says in another place, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayer and supplication with vehement cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things that he suffered. Well, we're talking about Jesus right there. So all he did is he introduced Melchizedek and went, let me tell you about Jesus. And he's going to come back to it. So now you see verse 9, and having been perfected, he, Jesus, became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you've become dull of hearing. You see what he's doing right here? He goes, he introduces this, and he goes, I got a lot to say about this, but you've become dull of hearing. And this is when this is the reason I say that he's introduced something difficult. And then says, you know, I'd love to strengthen your faith with this. But you don't care. You don't want to hear it. Now look, that's what he says in verse 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food, for everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he's a babe. I mean, that doesn't sound real nice. You know? He's saying, you don't get to just wear the jersey. You got to root for the team. You know, everybody, you just act like you want to be a part of this, but you don't really know what's going on. You got to know where we've come from and where we're going. You know, he says you are needing milk like a babe, and babes who need milk are unskilled in the word. That's basically saying you are unskilled in the word. So he's really beginning to challenge them. And that's the reason this discussion of Melchizedek, we're about to run out of time again. All right, let's keep going. So let's do this. Let's skip down to chapter 6. So he gives them this difficult wording scenario in chapter 6. But then he comes back in verse 19 of chapter 6. This hope you have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So he brings it up a second time. Remember, this study is a whole lot less about Melchizedek. This argument that he's using a whole lot less about Melchizedek and more about the fact that you can trust Jesus because God always planned to send him. And he shows you that by mentioning somebody, then telling you, hey, we're going to bring this up again, and then bringing it up again. So God had the argument that he was given to these Jewish converts in Jerusalem in mind because when he had it mentioned in Genesis. He wanted it in play so he could bring it up later. That's the reason this is the reason we're even combing through this like we are. Because the details don't really matter to us. The big picture is what matters to us. The details mattered to them when they wrote it. When they read it, because they were struggling with this. What you and I do, before we go any further, to kind of help us with this, what you and I have to do is say, when we study these things, it takes us back to the origin. And when we go back to the origin, we feel better about who we are. You question your faithfulness. You question whether, should I even go to church anymore? You know, like I said, that was a question I just mentioned about my dad. Should we even do this anymore? He's going to address that. They obviously were having the same problems because in Hebrews 10, he's going to say, don't be missing these opportunities to come. You see what I mean? Like they're struggling. So when we find ourselves struggling, the reason that this kind of study is important for us is it takes us back to an origin and says, God planned all along the way for this to go the way it is, and it went exactly like he wanted to. He had to adapt along the way because of the response of men, but that this was always how he wanted it to be done. And he did that by dropping this in. So now he's going to come back in chapter 7 and really, the whole book, the whole chapter, or what we call chapter 7, is all about this Melchizedek high priest connection. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. I think that's interesting, by the way, that he says translated. We don't have time for that. Okay, that he says is being translated two different ways there. Oh, I got 5 minutes. You just waving at me, aren't you? 5 minutes? That's not what that means. All right, let's go to verse 3. So he's going to tell us why I'm bringing this up. He says Melchizedek. He brings him up again. And he said, let me tell you why I'm bringing him up. Y'all are having a problem with Jesus as a high priest because he doesn't meet the lineage that you think he ought to meet. Undoubtedly, that was a struggle for some of these new converts. You're trying to tell me that Jesus is the high priest, but he didn't even come from the right tribe. I'll be honest with you. I'll be very honest with you. As by the book a kind of person as I am, that would have bothered me. It would have bothered me. It would have been a doubt in the back of my mind. I mean, I know all this stuff was going on, but doesn't this seem to be out of place? I thought all the priests came from the same lineage. He didn't even come from the same tribe. Well, the Hebrew writer is going to eliminate that for them. So he says, verse 3, without father, okay, we don't know who the guy's dad was. Without mother, we don't know who Melchizedek's mom was. Without genealogy, we don't know who his great-granddaddy or great-great-granddaddy was. All we know is what it said in the book of Genesis. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life. We don't have a tomb. We don't have a record of his birth. We don't know where he died. We don't know anything. And the end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. And so there's 3 major views, really 4, but one of them doesn't really matter. But there's 3 major views on who Melchizedek is. Some believe that he was a man who was a high priest, just like it says. Some believe that he was that was Jesus, like that Jesus, that was actually him, because Jesus was active in the Old Testament. We don't have time to get into all this part of it. Some believe that he was a made-up character, that was used as an example. That's actually one of the largest predominant views of this. Well, not one of the largest, it's one of the top three, which I think is ridiculous. I think what we have to do is focus on what the point is, because we're not ever, yeah.
The Hebrew writer is not necessarily pointing this out, but studying the type and antitype.
Yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning that Jesus and Melchizedek were both king and priest.
You're right. Of peace, right? Prince of peace. You know, I mean, that's, yeah. Yes.
One of the things that the Jews had a problem with Christ being the Messiah was they could point to who his mother and father were.
That's right. That's right. Now, so let's talk about that for a second then, because we only have 5 more minutes now, right? It's 5 minutes a minute ago. They know Jesus' parents. But the Hebrews writer is saying that he doesn't have parents. Because, see, he's making this type-antitype connection in real life. So he's demanding that they think of Jesus as he currently is, not as he was while here on earth. That's what, and who he was before. So keep going real quick. He says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, which is interesting that he says he was like the Son of God, and I'm trying to tell you about the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are the sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a commandment to receive tithes from the people. According to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promise. Now, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here, and that's an argument. He's throwing out an argument for them. Here, mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it's witnessed that he lives. So he's saying, okay, now this is proven there was the man. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So what he's doing right here is he's just trying to say Melchizedek was amazingly incredible, and everything we know about him was given to us so that I could now compare him to Jesus to help you believe more in Jesus, to help you. I think I'm running out of time. I want to spend some time on this, but I think the main takeaway for us is God has gone completely out of his way to give us everything we need to be faithful to him. That's the point of this discussion. He embedded a 2-verse introduction, a 1-verse mention, so that for the rest of time, there could be something that brought up that showed you something about God that you don't see when you read it. And that is, he's given us everything we need to have faith and confidence in him. And that's the reason this is being brought up. So in the next 5 minutes that I still have, I'm going to look at verse 11. Therefore, well, let me skip down. Look at he's going to be mentioned in 11. Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to Aaron? So he's saying, well, it's always gone through here, but there's this other lineage, don't forget. This one of Melchizedek that preceded all that. Now he's going to say, look down at verse 15, and it is yet far more evident if, in the likeness of Melchizedek, there arises another priest who has come, not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. You can see in his wording that he's building a case. And it is yet far more evident. The evidence shows he's building a case. For he testifies, and he says it again. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, there's an annulling of the former commandments because of its weakness and unprofitability. Don't forget, you're not under the Old Testament anymore. It was annulled. And for the law, the Old Testament made nothing perfect. On the other hand, there's the bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. And he just mentioned hope in chapter 6. That's the reason he says that. Now, come down a little bit further, verse 20. Inasmuch as he was not made priest without an oath, for they have become priests without an oath, but he with an oath, by him who said, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Third time he's mentioned this. By so much more, Jesus has become a surety of a better covenant. Also, there were many priests because they were prevented by death from continuing. But he, because it continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. And so his point is, you can trust the priesthood of Jesus. Now, you and I, that doesn't mean a lot. But if we step back and we say, there was a group of people who were questioning their allegiance to Jesus, to God through Jesus. And the argument that was given was, God planted a verse, 2 verses in Genesis, had them mentioned again in Psalms, so that he could help them understand why they should remain faithful to God through Jesus. It helps me understand, even if I don't understand the whole point, it helps me understand that God wants me to be faithful to him through Jesus. That's the point of all this. This high priest talk, I have a whole 2 pages on how Jesus matches up as the high priest that we may look at some of them next week. It's just a lot of information. It doesn't mean as much to us. This is the boring part of Hebrews. It's real. The first part, you get lost in this part of it. But the whole point is, God planned to send Jesus from the beginning, and he is exactly what God wanted him to be for you, and it's to your advantage to remain faithful to God through Jesus. That is the point. Let's look. Nobody's opening doors. I'm not getting dirty looks. Look at 23 through 28, and we'll be done here. So, also, there were many priests because they were prevented by death from continuing. He goes, there was one Melchizedek, there's one Jesus, but there were a lot in the middle, but they kept dying. There was a big problem with them. They couldn't stay alive. They just kept dying. And also, there were, verse 24, but he, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Therefore, he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And intercession was that big word the Jews had that they would listen to, that these guys were struggling with. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who's holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he died once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of the oath which came after the law appoints the Son who have been the Son who has been perfected forever. Y'all come on in. We're talking about Melchizedek. We got about 20 more minutes. Stanley, don't leave. I'm just kidding. All right. Everybody just stay right here.
Let me see if I got this straight.
You gonna be in all of it?
No. I won't be there. I'll drive through one of these days. God planned from the beginning. Everything that happened.
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. There's a difference in plan and know route. So I don't know that he planned the flood as much as he knew there would have to be one. Right. I don't think he said, I won't be able to get so bad enough to send a flood. He goes, I know when. Because, yes, But he knew what they choose.
Yeah, I've got to believe we had a 5-year. We call it. He's got a hard if you're
He could choose.
no. Because if he's in the past and present, he's in the future. So I think he knows what he can do. But that doesn't make him a child. So I think no, but faith or he knew he was going to have to start. So he chose it.
Yeah, you don't have to move the ball once you move the ball right. You know, one time, one hell of a
The Bible is full of interesting people. The Bible has so many different names, different people, different contexts. It's just full of different people. When you look at them, you think, what were they thinking, or where were they at? Why were they doing this? Why were they doing that? One of the stories I love the most is found in John chapter 6, verses 8 through 9. And there's 5,000 people out in the wilderness, and they're hungry. And Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he's talking about feeding them. And what I like the best is Andrew, who is never really mentioned much in the Bible, turns and says, there's a little boy over here who has 5 loaves and 2 fishes. What did we do with that? And Jesus didn't say anything. He said, have the people sit. And then he took the food, and you know the rest of the story. He fed them. I love the story because of 2 reasons. One, we're never really told much about Andrew, and here Andrew is the observant one. One, he saw a boy that had 5 loaves and 2 fishes. How many times do you walk up to somebody and want to look in their basket? How many times do you see someone and you think, well, what do they have with them? Or where they're going? Or just talking to them and figure out what's going on. The boy had several things also. The boy had a mission. We don't know what he's doing, but we know he had 5 loaves and 2 fish, so he's going somewhere. What was his plans that morning when he got up? He just went and was going somewhere. Maybe he brought his lunch. Maybe that's what he was going to eat. We don't know. But the story is real neat because through Andrew's actions and the little boy's actions, 5,000 people were fed that day. I want you to think about this. What would have happened if Andrew hadn't been observant? What would have happened if Andrew hadn't been looking around to see what the little boy had or what other people had? How would that have changed the story? Or what would happen if the little boy got up that morning and said, you know, I got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Maybe I need to get 5 more fish, so I'm going to catch me 3 more. And instead of the little boy going to listen to Jesus, he went and was fishing more and didn't go. Or what if the little boy sat there and said, I'm not going to share my food? And Andrew asked what he had, and he kind of hid it. You see, there's a lot of different ways that story could happen, but we know how it turned out. And here's what I want you to think about your life. 1, we have a purpose. We have something to do. We may not know what our purpose that day is, but we have a purpose that day. We go out and we do something, and our job is to share the gospel with people. Our job is to show the world the love that God has for us. 2, when we do meet those people, don't hide it. Like the old song, I was fixing to start singing a song. Don't put a basket over your light, your candlelight. Don't hide God's love. Don't sit there and be ashamed of who you are. Don't be ashamed to say, I'm a Christian, I'm a child of God. Don't be ashamed to say, God has blessed me with so many things, and I want to share them with the world. The boy had a purpose. He didn't hide who he was. And he was able to reach thousands of people by what he did. In our life, who are you talking to? Who are you sharing the gospel with? Who are you allowing to see your life, to see what kind of example you live, to see how we serve our God? The Bible's full of examples. And here's this little boy who's never named, but has a huge impact on our Christian life. Where are you standing with God? Are you allowing God to work through your life? Are you allowing God to look into your heart, into your being, and to take what you have and share with others? Are you allowing God to take you and put you where you need to be? Or are you being resistful, trying to pull back? Where do you stand with God? Don't put it off. We never know how much time we have left. We don't know how short our life's going to be. If there's something we do for you tonight, please come as we stand, as we sing.
I have found a friend in Jesus. He's everything to me. He's a very something thousand to my soul. The lily of the valley, in him alone I see. All I need to cleanse and make me fully whole. In sorrow he's my comfort, in trouble he's my strength. He tells me every care
good to see everyone tonight. If you're visiting with us, you're our special guest, and we hope that you'll stay around just a little bit and give us an opportunity to get to know you. If you haven't picked up a handout, please do so on your way out. I have no updates other than what's already in here for our sick. I do have one update to read and then just a couple of reminders. The update, as we've announced in the past, Jan Kalanick is putting together a cookbook, and there'll be a sign-up sheet on the board back there if you would like one, and just please sign that. And the ladies will have a meeting with the elders on Saturday morning at 8:30 over in the annex. We'd like to invite all the ladies to be there. If you have any questions, if you want to give them to an elder beforehand tonight, or if you just bring them with you, we'll do our best to answer them. The next thing is the Lads to Leaders banquet on April 19th, and everybody is invited. And that'll be after the PM service over there in the annex. Is there any other announcements I may have missed? Let's pray. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this week that we've had so far, Father, the beautiful weather that we can look around and see your creation about us, Father, and for this evening that we've had an opportunity to come and to spend a period of time in study of your word, Father, and fellowship with one another. Father, we ask that you be with us, that you guide us as we go about the rest of this week till we come together again this next Lord's Day. Father, we may show Jesus Christ and you living in us.